is to make sure that everybody is on the same page with some basic ideas and terminology. And then during the live synchronous session, you'll break into groups with other faculty to do work on your course plans and to give each other feedback on them. We're going to start out in this lecture looking at goals and objectives. Lecture 2 will look at Bloom's Taxonomy, which is a way of thinking about what we are asking students to do. Lecture 3 will look at differences between formative and summative assessment. And finally, in Lecture 4, we're going to connect everything together. One of the first things to know about objectives is that it's really good to tell your students what the objectives are of a lesson. So here are the objectives for this lesson. And notice that the idea here is that by the end, you will have the rough outline of a course, including assessment methods. Some of you are probably impatiently tapping your toes and saying, wait a second, when are we going to get to talking about online teaching? This workshop is going to be pretty general. It'll apply equally to online and face-to-face teaching. But given the challenges of online assessment, it's even more important to carefully think about assessment methods when designing online courses. So these overall ideas of course design are an important first step. The plan for your course that you have out of this workshop will be rough, and in the coming weeks, as you learn more about online teaching, you'll need to refine it. In everyday speech, we tend to use the words goals and objectives to mean more or less the same thing. But in course design, there's a distinction made between these two terms, and the distinction is useful. Goals are broad and general. Objectives are precise and achievable, and they're about action, whereas goals are intentions. Goals are ways that you hope your students will develop or change. They could be things that you want them to learn, or if you're more ambitious, perhaps changes to their behaviors or attitudes. But objectives are things that students will be able to do as a result of the learning. Since goals are about things that happen inside your students' heads, they're usually not measurable unless you're telepathic. If you're not telepathic, you need objectives which have to do with things your students do so that they're measurable. Some of you, particularly the humanities folks, might be squirming a bit at the use of the word measurable. I want to assure you, I don't by measurable mean quantifiable. Perhaps accessible or maybe observable would be better words, but measurable is the word that's generally used. So when you are, say, marking an essay, you are probably very skilled at assessing whether a student has made coherent arguments and whether their use of language is good. That's measurable for our purposes. To illustrate the differences, here are some examples. Pause and have a look at these. Here is a goal and an objective related to team leadership. Have a look at these ones. Here's a goal and an objective that might be appropriate for many mathematics courses. And pause and have a look at this one. Here's one that perhaps would be good for a political science course or maybe a history course. Goals and objectives don't have to be paired. Frequently, a goal gives rise to many objectives. So, for example, this goal to do with team leadership would likely give rise to many different objectives having to do with different aspects of team leadership. And the broad general statement about students writing mathematical proofs can break up into many different objectives, which perhaps would be relevant in subtopics within a course. It's also possible for an objective to simultaneously be connected to multiple goals, though that's rarer and more difficult. Notice that in all the examples I just gave, the goals started with students will learn. Remember, unless you're telepathic, you have no way of actually knowing what your students have learned directly. You need, for an objective, to set a goal of them taking some observable action. Not all goals start with students will learn, but many do. But for an objective, you need things like students will state, students will calculate, students will debate, students will critique. Those are all good starts for objectives. If you are watching this video via a lesson on Moodle, The video will end, and you'll then click on to the next page in the lesson, which is going to ask you a question, just to make sure that you're following along. The lesson will then take you on to the next part of this lecture. Hello and welcome back. This is part 2 of the lecture on goals and objectives in the university teaching program. As we go on, most of the focus is going to be on objectives, but I think a misconception that can easily arise is that the objectives are the really important part and the goals don't matter so much, they're just a route to get to the objectives. That's false. I would argue that the thing that really matters is the goals. Those are what you want your students to learn or how you want them to develop as people. For you as an instructor, that's probably the part that really matters. The thing to recognize, though, is that we can't directly assess that. The objectives are an opportunity to think about the proxies that will help you assess whether your students have reached the goals that you have set. Let's keep our eyes on the prize and the purpose of all this. What we're trying to do is connect objectives to assessment. Since an objective is a description of something that you are going to get a student to do, they are direct statements of what you intend to assess. So the process of course planning when you're doing it with this method is to start with your goals, break them up into more detailed objectives, and since they are statements of things students will do, they will allow you to make a detailed assessment plan. So your objectives give you a checklist of what to assess, but you can actually go farther than that. As we'll see in the following lectures, we can also use our objectives for clues on how to assess. In other words, if we write our objectives carefully, they can help us decide which assessment tools are most suitable. One thing to be aware of is that there are already some goals, and to a lesser extent objectives, that are pre-written for you, and that's lists of graduate attributes. So here's an extract of CBU's institutional graduate attributes, and you may also be aware that the programs you teach in also have graduate attributes. I'm just going to do a bit of a preview of Lecture 2 and point out that part of this is mostly things that we would say are in the cognitive or thinking domain, and part of this is mostly in the affective or emotional or social domain. But now going back to goals and objectives. You can pull goals straight out of the lists of graduate attributes, and many of us, as we're designing our courses, probably should be pulling goals straight out of the graduate attributes. So here's one about students becoming experienced communicators. Now, there isn't really a great objective here on the graduate attributes lists, but it's pretty easy to construct them. Here's an objective. It's not the best objective I've ever seen, and you might think about how you could make it more specific for your courses. Similarly, here's a goal to do with students becoming culturally and ethically aware. And it's not hard to put together a perfectly good objective here, which might be an appropriate objective for many of you in your courses. So, I do encourage you to look at the graduate attributes and think about how you can address them in your own courses. When people talk about Bloom's taxonomy, most of the time they're talking about a picture like this. And if you go and Google Bloom's taxonomy, this is very likely what you're going to come up with. It is a ranking of cognitive tasks from remember at the bottom to create at the top, going from low complexity to high complexity. Before going on and talking more about what Bloom's taxonomy is, it might be worth taking a moment to talk about what it isn't. I don't think that a cognitive scientist or a psychologist would accept it as a model of human thought. But it isn't intended as a model of human thought. It's only intended as a framework for thinking about tasks that we ask students to do in their process of learning. Used in that way, it's very valuable. Usage for other purposes may void the warranty. Another objection to Bloom's taxonomy is that any given cognitive task might not slot neatly into one of the levels in the taxonomy. Finally, it's generally taken as part of Bloom's taxonomy that higher-level tasks require lower-level tasks. So, for example, if you've ever created anything, like writing a paper, you will have frequently sat back to evaluate whether it's any good. So it's fairly clear that creating involves evaluating. But does evaluating using an idea always involve analyzing using that idea? And to what extent do you need to understand an idea to apply it? So we shouldn't be too rigid or dogmatic in our thinking about Bloom's taxonomy. If you're new to Bloom's taxonomy, some of this ranking probably makes perfect sense. You're probably quite willing to say that remember is the least complex thing here, and especially given my example of creation tending to involve evaluation, perhaps you're willing to put create at the top of the ranking. These middle things, though, analyze, apply, and understand, you may be less clear on what the exact distinctions are between them and why they're in that order. Don't worry about that too much. As you play around with Bloom's taxonomy, that will become clearer. But also, don't get too hung up on always being able to slot every task unambiguously into a level on Bloom's taxonomy. You really just want to be able to classify tasks as high, mid, or low complexity. Indeed, the order probably isn't rigid. In Bloom's original taxonomy in 1956, the top two levels were reversed, and it was in 2001 in a revision that they got put in their current order. Also, just realize when you look up Bloom that you may come up with either the old or the new version depending on where you look. Also, you'll notice that the original was all stated in terms of nouns. Now, Anderson and Krathwohl did not verbify it, but these days when people talk about Bloom's taxonomy, they tend to talk about it in terms of verbs because we're using it to think about learning objectives, which are all about what we have students do. The connection of the levels of Bloom's taxonomy to verbs is crucial when we're using it to think about objectives. Go online and just Google Bloom's taxonomy keyword, and you'll find that people have compiled often very long lists of keyword verbs. So now when you write an objective, you can look at what the key verb is in the objective, and that'll often give you a pretty good idea of what level of Bloom's taxonomy the objective is lying upon. We'll look at this more in lecture number 4. For now, here's an example. Though I'm not going to classify objectives, I'm going to classify tasks which could exemplify objectives. So I could ask a student to define something like acceleration, and I would accept a sentence or an equation. In this case, perhaps I would accept a definition of a closely related thing called the average acceleration. In any case, just stating a definition is at the remember level. On the other hand, I might ask them to explain how the equation and the sentence mean the same thing, or something you might be wondering is what all these little arrows mean. Either way, it's an explanation, and that's probably at the understand level. Or I could give them some values and ask them to calculate the average acceleration. That might not look simple to you, but all they have to do if they understand the equation is take the values and plug them in, and they'll get the answer. So this is a straightforward application of the equation. Finally, and skipping a few levels in the taxonomy, I might give a question like this. Now this is quite complex. They would use the definition of acceleration somewhere in the solution, but it would also involve a number of other ideas. Those could be put together in many ways, and there are many possible solutions that would all arrive at the correct answer. So this involves synthesis of several facts or ideas, and there are multiple correct ways to complete the task. Those are all characteristic of something at the create level in Bloom's taxonomy. Well, that's the end of this part of the lecture. If you're doing this through Moodle, then the lesson will have you click on to the next page, and it'll ask you a question before taking you to the next part. Hi again, everyone. It's Jeff, and this is part 2 of the lecture on Bloom's taxonomy in the university teaching program. We've been looking at this diagram, which is a ranked hierarchy of cognitive tasks. where higher level tasks are generally thought to involve the lower level ones. Strictly speaking, this is not the whole taxonomy, although as we move on to the other parts, it's no longer really Bloom's taxonomy because Bloom didn't come up with the whole thing. The taxonomy often gets divided into 3 domains, one to do with academic and thinking skills, one that's emotional and social, and one that's physical and emotional. The technical terms are the cognitive domain, affective domain, and psychomotor domain. So we've been looking at the cognitive domain. The affective domain was come up with later, and Bloom was still involved with this one. There are several versions of the psychomotor domain that have been published, and as far as I know, Bloom wasn't involved with them. We will focus on the cognitive domain, partly because it's where most of the work has been done by people, and for most of you, it will be the most relevant. However, I'm going to argue that you really shouldn't neglect the affective domain. For most of you, the psychomotor domain probably isn't as important, but for some of you, if you're teaching sports or outdoor activity-related courses or dance or acting, the psychomotor domain is probably crucial. Also, if you're feeling that the taxonomy is just way too simple, I'll point out that there's a recent revision that introduces a 2-dimensional taxonomy. Here it is. I actually really like this 2-dimensional taxonomy. I find it's often easier to place things in it because it's less ambiguous. However, if you're new to Bloom's taxonomy, I really don't recommend it, and for our purposes, it would be like swatting a fly with a sledgehammer. Before finishing up this lecture, I just want to point you at the affective domain and emphasize that you shouldn't neglect it. So here are some of CBU's graduate attributes, and it'll now be more meaningful to you than it was in Lecture 1 when I say that the academic dimensions are mostly cognitive domain related and the personal dimensions are largely affective domain. So let's look at something in the personal dimensions and see if we can make a reasonable objective out of it. Here's a proposed objective that I could make out of this item in the personal dimensions. However, if you're paying close attention, and particularly if you're an aficionado of Bloom's taxonomy, you might not like what I just did. I just took a statement that started with appreciate and recognize the value of, and I replaced it with an objective using the words compare and contrast. Now, compare and contrast is definitely cognitive domain. It's usually placed at the analyze level in cognitive domain, whereas appreciate and recognize value would be at the value level of affective domain. So I've taken something affective and turned it into a cognitive objective. Well, probably the number of courses where students are going to do the really hard work of unpacking their own value systems and examining them in the light of other value systems is a pretty small fraction of courses, but you can move them in that direction by getting them first to engage intellectually with the material. Now, some of you, particularly those of you like me in STEM fields, might be feeling that all this affective domain stuff is pretty woolly-headed and touchy-feely, way too touchy-feely for your courses. But I want to point you at the engineering program graduate attributes. The engineering program is hardly touchy-feely, but have a look at these attributes. These are mostly or entirely affective domain. So those of us in STEM fields should be paying attention to the affective domain. The primary idea in this lecture is formative and summative assessment. Formative assessment is primarily intended to provide feedback, both to the students to guide their learning and to the instructor to guide their teaching. In contrast, summative assessment is principally about giving marks. Formative assessment usually happens all through the course, whereas summative is often at the end of the course. And formative assessment tends to be low stakes, by which I mean low weight marking, whereas summative assessment is often high stakes. One thing to notice about these descriptions is all the weasel words. Primarily, usually, often. There's a fuzzy boundary between formative and summative. In fact, as I'm going to argue in a moment, it's probably better to think of it as a spectrum rather than as 2 distinct categories. In reading about formative and summative assessment, it's very easy to come away with the impression formative good, summative bad, and that's certainly an oversimplification. There are certainly some courses which kind of need summative assessment, although I'll point out that's primarily because we're in a system which requires that we give marks. Nevertheless, it is true that very few courses are improved by having more summative assessment, whereas almost any course will be improved by having more formative assessment. The reason for this is quite simple. Formative assessment is about feedback, and when well designed, it will improve student learning. Assuming that the primary purpose of your course is that students will learn, that means formative assessment is a good thing. Another reason to want to reduce summative assessment is its high-stakes nature. High-stakes evaluation tends to make it much more likely that students will cheat, simply because the motivation and reward for doing so is higher. As I said earlier, I think it's more useful to think of formative and summative as a spectrum. Part of the reason is that you can then think of a summative evaluation, and instead of thinking about how to replace it with a formative evaluation, you can think about how to modify it to make it more formative. So here's a scale in International Standard Formative Summative Units. Just kidding, obviously there's no such thing. About the most summative evaluation possible is a final exam. It provides no feedback and is all about marks. Midterms are a little bit formative because students get them back and in principle can get feedback from them, but in practice students rarely look at anything other than the mark on their midterm, and so it's very poor in terms of its formative value. Similarly, weekly quizzes are a little more formative because of the frequency of potential feedback, but the actual feedback is likely not very good. However, as soon as you give multiple tries on quizzes, which is hard to do in class but very easy to do online, it now has significant formative value. About the most formative possible would be to have a weekly quiz where they learn what their mark would be, but the only mark recorded is a participation mark. Similarly, a final term paper, where students are simply expected to write it and turn it in at the end of the course, is very summative. But if they have multiple opportunities for feedback with early drafts or feedback on outlines, then that becomes much more formative. Giving a single seminar will be very summative, but if students give several seminars with feedback in between, that's much more formative. Finally, I do something that I call mastery tasks, where students visit me one-on-one and are given a task. They complete it and I mark it in front of them, and if it's right, it's marked as done. If it's wrong, they try again, and again, for as many times as it takes to get it right. And the mark doesn't depend on how many tries it took. That's completely formative. To finish this lecture, I'm going to address the elephant in the room when it comes to moving online. I'm going to do it by contrasting two courses. Course A uses seminars. Students hand in reflections on the readings, they get feedback on those reflections and opportunities to resubmit. Then in class, they role-play debates between foundational theorists. They get feedback on those and an opportunity to improve in future role-playing debates. This is substantially formative, and it has a big live one-on-one component in the assessment, which is essentially cheat-proof. Other than some concerns over students' internet speed and perhaps the discussions in class taking too long and needing to move some of it out to asynchronous discussion, this course is probably good to go in switching to online. It probably won't need very large changes to the assessment methods. Now Course B. It has a very simple evaluation plan, 2 midterms and a final. And in moving this online, this would be an unmitigated disaster. The primary purpose of exams is their security, that you know the answer you're reading is the student's answer. Online, that simply isn't true, and while there are ways to make online exams more secure, they will never be as secure as live exams. Now, the evaluation scheme in Course A will only work in certain courses, so I'm certainly not saying that Course B needs to turn into Course A. But the instructor for Course B had better think of ways to reduce the reliance on exams. There are many possibilities, but they will probably all involve a shift towards frequent formative assessments, and if possible, they may involve an increased use of one-on-one assessment. In Lecture 2, we saw how the levels in Bloom's taxonomy are often associated with keyword verbs, and that you can use these keyword verbs to help you decide what level in the taxonomy an educational objective lies on. If you look around online, you'll see that some people have made enormously long lists of these keyword verbs. In the long run, I'm not actually sure how useful these lists of keywords are, but as you're getting to know your way around Bloom's, looking through them can be useful to start to get a better sense, say, of the differences between the levels understand, apply, and analyze. However, what I'm going to show you is a case where keyword verbs can be useful, a case where they end up being misleading, and then another case. So here is an objective that I gave as an example way back in Lecture 1 about students critiquing how a theory of state formation describes the history of some country. This one is pretty easy to classify. Critique is very similar to criticize, and this is indeed at the evaluate level. They would be evaluating the extent to which a theory applies to a particular case. However, it's not that straightforward all the time. For example, if you take a close look at some of these lists of keyword verbs, you'll see that often the same word will appear on the lists for several levels in the taxonomy. This is just because, of course, our use of language is often somewhat vague. We can use the same word to mean multiple things. Also, there's an additional problem that certain disciplines use certain words in very specific ways, often to mean quite different things from the everyday use. So here's another example. Again, this is an objective that I gave as an example in Lecture 1, where students are to use proof by induction to prove statements in number theory. Now the verb seems to be use, and that appears in the keyword list for apply. But apply is an awfully low level on Bloom's taxonomy for this task. If you're a mathematician, you probably see that. Also, if you look at some of these lists, you'll often see prove appear at the analyze level. Well, that's not really what's going on here. Often, mathematicians will say construct a proof rather than just prove, and that gives a better clue of what's going on here. Construct sounds an awful lot like something at the create level, and so I would argue this objective is at the create level of Bloom's taxonomy. Overall, the point here is that the keyword lists can be useful, but they can also be misleading. Sometimes you need to think of how to rephrase the objective to make what level of Bloom's it lies on clearer. And finally, it's your disciplinary knowledge that will often be a better guide than any list of keywords. Let's look at one more example. Here's the remaining example objective that I gave in Lecture 1, and this is about group work and making a plan for a project. Now, if you just use a keyword list, you might be tricked easily. Define often is on the remember level, but that certainly doesn't seem right. Define a plan could be thought of as make a plan, and so maybe that puts that at create, but that doesn't feel right either, does it? And the key here is that actually we shouldn't be looking at define a plan. This objective is not talking about defining a plan, it's talking about facilitating a process to get some people to define a plan. Well, I've given you a big hint after leading you astray, and I want you to think about why it is difficult to identify the Bloom's level of this objective. Remember that the point of this is to come up with an assessment plan, so let's now make the connection between Bloom's levels and assessment tools, and hopefully this is fairly intuitive. Things like multiple choice or perhaps matching questions are great at the low levels of Bloom's taxonomy, but it's pretty hard to come up with good multiple choice questions that get much past the apply level. Short answer and numerical questions and the like can be used at slightly higher levels, perhaps up to the analyze level, but not likely any higher than that. Discussions and seminars are great at the mid-levels. They're not so great usually for getting up at the create level, and I suppose you could use them at the low levels like remember, but why would you? There are easier ways to assess there. Essays and problem sets and the like are good across the whole range, but particularly excel at the highest levels of Bloom's taxonomy. And what we've got here is a list from things that are easy to automate up to things that are nearly impossible to automate. Here is the thing you'll need to wrestle with. To wrap up, I'm just going to mention a few things that I hope we will have time to discuss during the live session for this module. Objectives can be course-wide, but you can also have topic unit objectives, specific objectives for specific subtopics within the course. This, of course, doesn't apply to all courses. Some courses don't reasonably divide up neatly into topic units. However, if your course does divide up into topic units, then it is worthwhile thinking about how the course objectives lead to more specific topic unit objectives. Finally, if you identify an objective that is at a high level on Bloom's taxonomy, it's usually not reasonable to just throw the students into the deep end and expect them to achieve that objective on their own. You usually have to do some scaffolding, and that means leading them through lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy to build up their skills so that they're able to achieve the high-level objective.